all the ancient wisdom will be corrupted in translation, etc. Because most of the people, like modern new age influencers, are maybe not translators but interpreters of the data. So they corrupt to some extent the original wisdom, and I'm open to speculation, I'm open to that, I'm open to discovering the truth. Because you mentioned that those you mentioned thought, low vibe, etc. I also think that plenty of ancient sources are low vibe. Plenty of ancient sources are maybe not untrue, but not 100% true. Half wisdom, half lies, half imagination, etc. Some sources are lies. Some are lying to achieve something. They wanted to achieve power at that time, so they were saying things like that.
Welcome to the Consciousness of the Way. I'm your humble servant and seafood Taoist Master Sun Qing, and we have deja vu, literally, with all puns aside. The incredible author of Deja Vu, a returning guest to the podcast. Welcome back, Alex. How are you, my friend?
Thanks for having me again. I'm fine, and I hope that all of the listeners enjoyed our last conversation. And today
Yes.
we will talk more about some down to earth stuff, more about stuff related to history, philosophy, like material evidence based things.
Yeah. Yes. Please have the stage, my friend. Please start sharing an exploration into these very things. I'm very excited.
Yes, I think we should start with what you talked about during our last conversation, about which we weren't talking much. You mentioned that the history may be much older, that from your perspective, according to your own inner visions, etc., I don't know what exactly,
Yeah.
but you mentioned that the history may be much older, like 80,000 years
Yes.
ago, etc. And that was actually one of the main key ideas in my book, Deja Vu Has Everything Already Been? Because the title is the Deja Vu, so about the cyclical history, repeating history, but has everything already been and in search of a previous lost civilization? My initial thought when I started writing this book at a very early age, it was like I was 16, 17 years of age, was that our history may be much older than it is accepted by the mainstream, nowadays paradigm of history. And I find it quite interesting because we think that we know so much about our history. But if we take a look at the history of science, the history of our modern history,
Hmm.
it will turn out that we do not know that much about our history that we are thinking. And I think that we are to a little extent a little bit arrogant about all of the stuff that we know in science, in history. Because when I looked back 200 years, 400 years, our understanding of the history of civilizations, of ancient times prehistory, was completely different. And everything, our entire picture of history was completely different. During even the medieval times, we thought that in the Western, of course, culture, we thought that everything started with the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. And we thought that the first civilizations were probably civilizations of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. And even at that point, during our history, we didn't know much about Egypt and almost nothing about civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia or ancient India. It is quite interesting because nowadays we are thinking, oh, ancient Egypt or the cradle of civilization is ancient Sumer, but actually, just less than 200 years ago, we started rediscovering those civilizations. Before that, 300 years ago, we thought that they either weren't that old or that they didn't exist. Because we started rediscovering, for instance, civilizations from the area of ancient Mesopotamia only in 1840s, which is like 180 years ago. And before that, like 200 years ago, we even thought that those civilizations that were mentioned in this area, like even in the Bible, there were mentions that Abraham came from the Sumerian city of Ur. We thought that those mentions were just imagination of our ancestors, fairy tales, etc. And then in the 1840s, we started digging more and more in that area of ancient Mesopotamia, and we started discovering entire cities and then entire even civilizations. And nowadays, it is like casual knowledge that one of the first civilizations was ancient Sumer in the area of the ancient Mesopotamia. So I was interested not in what we are taught at school about this is a fact, that this was the first civilization, etc. I was more interested in what those first civilizations, the civilizations that we think were the first, thought about themselves, whether they were thinking they were the first or not. And I was interested in the entire like philosophy of science, especially when it comes to history. Because when I was learning at school, and I was learning a lot at school, it was like this is a fact. There was ancient Egypt, there was ancient Sumeria, etc., etc. But actually, when it comes to history, it isn't like a solid science like physics or chemistry, in which we can replicate an experiment plenty of times to prove a point that, this equation is true to a large extent, or this chemical reaction is true. History is more about interpretation, about interpreting the facts. We have some sources, we have some like evidence, like we have some vases, we have some texts, ancient texts, we have some buildings, we have some remains, but it is our interpretation of how it looked like. These are just ruins, but we interpret because we have some data, we have some facts, we have some evidence. We interpret that during those times, ancient Rome looked like that, plus minus, with some percentage of error, of course, but it is all about interpretation, and we do not have technology to go back in time and see how it really appeared. And that's why during our history we're changing our perspective, either on the medieval times or of the times of the Columbus or the ancient times, because we do not have 100% of the evidence. Like for instance in physics, if we have so many evidence about the particles, about that, and that, we can assume and we can replicate, we can experiment if our assumptions are true, and this is science. But when it comes to history, our image, our big picture of how the past looked like is blurry. It's not 100% true, and most probably, without the technology or inner spirituality, inner visions, etc., it will probably never be full and fully true because we do not have 100% of the evidence. Even we can see that we do not know everything about our new history, our contemporary history, because we have so many mysteries that happened during 1950s. We do not know everything that happened 20 years ago. So imagine how much we know about what happened 1,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, or more. That's why I think that the modern point of view of many skeptics, of many proponents of solid hard science, who tell many of people like me and most probably you that
Hmm.
we may think that our history may be much older. Maybe we do not state that history is much older, that Atlantis 100% existed, but we speculate that it may be older. We have some evidence here, and there. And, those people of the hard proponents of science and skeptics, I think, are a little bit, maybe from one side, arrogant, and from the other side, they do not have imagination that there is always a possibility for something more to exist. And they, of course, exclude any possibility of Atlantis, any possibility of the previous civilizations, or any possibility of the history of civilization to be older than the civilizations of Egypt, Sumer, India, or other of the first civilizations. So I think that on the one side, there are many of people that are very arrogant, that they think that we know so much about our history and about our distant past that we can totally exclude the existence of Atlantis, Lemuria, and other stuff like that. And on the other hand, there are people who are who just, I think, lack imagination and insight to think, oh, maybe we do not know everything about our history. So this was my initial point of view when I started writing and researching for my book Deja Vu Has Everything Already Been, because I found out that plenty of the things that I was learning at school were taught to us as facts. But if you start thinking about those facts, if you start, thinking how they even are, how can they even be considered as facts, you start questioning, you start going further, you start going deeper and deeper into the process of science, of the understanding of history, and you start questioning more and more, and you start seeing that there is so much potential even when it comes to like our history from 500 years ago, from 8,000 years ago. And when I heard, as you mentioned last times, I heard it like 5 or 6 years ago, that the history of Homo sapiens sapiens may be about 200,000 years ago, or even 400,000 years ago, depending whether you are in the conservative part about genetics and stuff like that, or you see that there are some evidence, there are some remnants of humans from 400,000 years ago. If you see 200,000 years ago and 400,000 years ago, and you know that our history started somewhere 3,000 years before current era, you see that there is an enormous gap, like 95% of the existence of humanity that is completely lost. And I have plenty in my book of like timelines showing that if you show 200,000 years ago with the conservative estimates of geneticists about the DNA fusion that happened at that time, and you see that our history is about 5,000 years old, you see 95, 96% of the history lost, which is like an entire timeline, and then you have like a little bit of the actual history. So I was maybe a little bit maybe not naive, but I was like very young and open-minded. If there is like 190,000 years, there is a huge potential. So many different things could have happened during that enormous gap in our history, in the evidence we have. Because according, I was searching and searching, and I was searching history, ancient history, then prehistory, then archaeology, paleontology, and I found out that we of course have like the remnants from even millions of years ago, of course. But when it comes to the understanding of the existence of humans for that long, it is like we've been hunter gatherers for so many years and we have made no progress. We're doing no progress until the Neolithic Revolution 10,000 years BC, which is still like 90 something percent of our existence. We were doing nothing. We're cavemen, we're hunter gatherers, no progress, which is not only against our human nature but also against the principles of evolution. For some reason, we started having those advanced capabilities of our intellect, of our minds, and all of the like modern, because when we say 200,000 years ago of existence of modern humans, we mean anatomically modern humans, more similar to me and you than to the previous hominids. So we are thinking here of very advanced beings like us, not some like previous generations, previous species of humanoid beings. So, there is a huge potential, and I saw that and I thought there could have been actually plenty of civilizations during that time gap. Maybe not as advanced as are today, but at least as advanced as ancient Egypt or ancient Sumer. And I thought, why aren't we searching into that? Why are we still thinking that tales like the tale of Atlantis, etc., are just fairy tales and imaginary fiction of our ancestors? Why aren't we just maybe considering that there may be some truth in them? Modern paradigm is completely excluding any possibility of truth in them.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just agree with you, 1,000,000%, because I mean, just the simplicity of when I share that, even though I'm fully aware of the what historians consider the timeline of Chinese history, I know very well intuitively from my direct source from my teachers that, oh my goodness, we're talking a couple of 100,000 years, and then it's a different cycle I mean, I need to go deeper to have that conversation, but they can lay it right out. And when I tell people that things like, the Tao Te Ching was around well before the timeline that they're considering as fact, people are like, that's nonsense. 10,000, 20,000 years ago, Lao Tzu lived at blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I'm getting it directly from source, my friend. And I actually just finished transcribing a direct source updated 2024 version of the Tao Te Ching, having Lao Tzu giving me word for word. And trust me, this stuff had my translator in tears, and she's a native from China. And so she translated it back into simplified Mandarin and also Pinyin, and she was just bawling her eyes out with the power behind these words. And so I didn't pull them out of the sky. I don't have that type of poetic insight in profound wisdom. I don't claim to ever have had. I just source the information directly from my teachers. And when the world puts their eyes on this Tao Te Ching, things are going to change dramatically for many people, because it's so powerful and it's palpable, and you can feel it in the spoken word through the resonance of your whole physical body. So I agree with you a million percent on what you're saying, Alex. Now, what about this whole discovery? They're going down the path of the emerald tablets, what that really means, who was really Jesus. Jesus was a healer. They removed it from the Bible. There's all this other stuff going on today. It seems to be very controversial. I find it completely tangible, viable. I don't consider it unreal by any stretch of the imagination. I've never just walked down that path. What are your thoughts on that? And do you have any more insight personally, being a historian yourself?
Mm-hmm. I've actually analyzed tons of sources. Even as I mentioned, I wrote my book, which is like a large book, like 450 pages, and there is like about 50 or 70 pages of footnotes and bibliography. So even it was like 2 or 3 years ago that I finished it, and it had like 100+ sources, and now I'm in collection of like almost 1,000 of different sources, and also of some PDFs, etc. So I analyze tons of history when it comes to ancient civilizations, but also you mentioned history of like emerald tablets, which would be considered like wisdom from ancient Egypt, Greece, Hermeticism, a little bit of Gnosticism, etc. But I would say you mentioned those a little bit controversial ones, like the emerald tablets, like Jesus, like those things that
Yeah,
were
yeah.
excluded from the Bible. And I have to say that we people need to be careful, because lots of stuff, and I don't want to say that it isn't true, because I want to point to lots of people, of influencers, like in our space. I would call influencers, not everyone is like either an author, etc., but lots of people are mis- are taking those things that you mentioned, those controversial things, from different sources. They say it is ancient wisdom, ancient knowledge, but it is more, like you mentioned, channeling the Tao Te Ching. And they mention for instance, emerald tablets of Thoth, and they are mentioning lots of knowledge, and they are even quoting stuff, but they don't know that those things were also channeled some time ago, and these aren't the true sources from antiquity. There is a source called Tabula Smaragdina, or the Emerald Tablet from antiquity, and even interestingly, Isaac Newton was one translating it into English. There is a source like that, but it is much shorter and contains some of like golden nuggets that are mentioning nowadays, with all of those people talking about the emerald tablets, etc. But they are misleading people. They are talking, this is the ancient wisdom, this is true source, but actually these are mostly channeled versions, and I don't want to dismiss those, but
Hmm?
we have to like be able to distinguish the true sources from our own interpretation, because we can sometimes interpret those sources and base our reflections on the sources. But there are some sources, like you mentioned. You mentioned that you are not into that wisdom philosophy, etc. when it comes to your Dao De Ching, your version. So we have
Well,
to
well
distinguish that from the original sources and may. Yes, yes.
I want to point out that one of the founders of one of the monasteries I'm ordained in China directly channeled through from Lao Tzu, the very foundation of his monastery. Now, at a deeper level, Lao Tzu's own confessions, he channeled the Tao Te Ching from the universe. So, there's this whole layer. It's okay. So this is supposedly fact, the most translated scripture in human history being the Tao Te Ching, more than the Bible. And yet, let me see, the translations are so variable that, like, you look at one verse and there's 100 different versions of this translation, supposedly from direct text, which I find very interesting, that there can be such a skewed variable, where in most cases I find a lot of these Tao Te Ching translations very fear-based, and that's not how that the Tao is received or transmitted from a priest of a Taoist monastery, two lineages of Taoism. That's not the message of the Tao. The Tao is not about any fear based whatsoever. It's about realizing the internal power you have as a facet of conscious, as the universe. So when the second I see a translation where it's got something to do with a fear based idea, my personality gets a little dismissive, in the sense of the word.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with you 100%. And there is a runaway train going on right now with that very person that's sort of directly. Now, I've had direct communication and channeling with Thoth, and I wasn't really impressed with the energy that I channeled. Quite frankly, his
Mm.
message was, I'm using the emerald tablets as a way to hypnotize people and access their body, mind, and spirit at a deeper level of a puppeteer. It's almost like he literally confessed it as being a psyop to take over people's minds. And I'm like, whoa, this is not good. I was like, this energy is very low frequency.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, it may be. And actually, this I would start with, you mentioned that some of the the versions of Dao De Ching that we have are a little bit fear based, right? So it is interesting because we mentioned Emerald Tablets. It is connected with, you mentioned Thoth, Hermes Trismegistus.
Mm-hmm.
There is a passage in one of the original texts, Corpus Hermeticum, which was like a little bit from older antiquity, but still ancient, from about 3rd century BC to 3rd century AD, and it mentions that the original words will be always corrupted in translation, and that's why we should strive to go to the source. And this is, and I also agree, but unfortunately, when it comes to history, that's why I made this distinction between, you mentioned channeling, source, going for truth. I would like to go for that route, but we live in a world of, hard skepticism, etc., and that's why I like to distinguish those things, the material evidence, the true ancient texts, whether there are few based, not true or not, because if we start going for, truth, high vibe, I think that modern world isn't prepared yet on a holistic level. You know what I mean? If you started about this Dao De Ching and I was a true historian from, from the academia, from the academic perspective, I would say that it is like some, some charlatanism, etc. And that's why
I mean,
I.
I want to say one more thing. There's a physicist right now called uh, I'm sorry, what's his name? Nassim Harriman.
Uh-huh.
I don't know whether you even know who
Yeah, I
that
know
is.
him.
Right. So he doesn't have a PhD behind his name. He used to be a ski instructor. He's highly intelligent dude that can access information very quickly and is very articulate. but has a unified field theory that
Hmm.
validates the very understanding that most people that are physicists today are confirming as their hypothesis or their method, their theory of everything as being the very inner understanding of it. And I think you and I may have spoken on that whole, the 0 point field and that type of stuff in our past podcast. So I don't dismiss. I resonate with information that's direct in relation to the individual, just as I think your contributions are so powerful. And you don't have a PhD behind your name, but your insight, I know right here, is on point. And I know you're going to a place where, at a certain point, through our relationship, through many things, because I'm going to continue having you back on this channel because your insight is powerful. And I don't think we could stop talking about this stuff, and we'll just keep progressing. You will be discovered by the world. And I promise you, they will realize the powerful insight that you have. And that charge that you and I are experiencing right now, that's real. That.
I uh-huh.
Yeah, go
Yes,
ahead.
I think that I have an idea of how to answer all of the things that we started talking about and didn't finish in this conversation with a crucial, like, primary understanding of the history and of the, I would say, modern view, about everything. You mentioned theory of everything, so I would talk about the theory of everything when it comes to the history of how even modern history when it comes to the academic history works. And you mentioned theory of everything, we mentioned different things. We have to go from the beginning to understand it all. Modern history, and I would say even science, is biased, because when I would if I started and if I wanted to go and pursue knowledge and pursue the truth about the universe, about our reality, whatever, because even naming it universe is like a little bit limiting, I wouldn't assume anything. I would maybe I would assume that things exist because I see them, I experience them. Okay, basic assumptions that things exist, but I don't know whether they are like that or they are like that. But as I mentioned in our last conversation, even the scientific method is biased because one of the main assumptions is that everything is matter and its interaction. But what if there are things that are non-material? Now, science excludes all of that at its principle, so it is already biased. When it comes to the history, and I learned a lot about the skeptics and about the academic history, very in-depth philosophy of science, I would say that most of the skeptics, most of those popular science authors and presenters are also biased because they learned so much. They are like relying on the information that already exists. I started from the beginning. I start my research from the beginning that I want to discover things. And they start because they have, as you mentioned, some credentials. They were learning a lot and they start from all of those assumptions that already exist. But what if I mentioned some of those assumptions, for instance, about history, are not true? Then the whole paradigm is collapsing. But they trust because they mention science is peer reviewed. They mention that we have so many evidence that our prehistory was like that, etc., that we can have some assumptions. Okay, but they are biased because they say, for instance, when it comes to our history and going beyond just casual civilizations like Egypt, etc. They say that we have so many evidence for hunter-gatherers, for prehistory. We have so many skeletons. We have so many like axes. We have so many like primitive shelters that we it is easier for us to assume that this is how our history really happened, that people were primitive. Now, we have so many evidence that before ancient Egypt, that before ancient Sumer, that before all of the first civilizations, we have only remnants of primitive people that it is easy for us to assume that our history was like that. But still, this is like maybe even it is 60 or 80% of the evidence, but there is also the rest 20. And when I started researching history, the Another problem is that we rely on sources, that we rely on material stuff, and material stuff is fragile, of course. Even we do not know everything about the past day, what happened yesterday. We do not have even right now the entire picture of what happened yesterday because we are humans and most of the things that we are doing are inside our heads. You know what I mean? Maybe I'm doing that, I'm going to this place, but my motivation is inside of me and maybe only I know about it. Maybe I share some details with other persons, but my motivations are most often and of most of the humanity unconscious. We know only about the material stuff, but what goes inside of the heads of humans is like the rest 90-95% of the entire happenings of the entire universe of the entire history. And when it comes to material remnants, there is only a fragment, a fraction of everything that happened, for instance yesterday, to be, for to have an easy example. What happened yesterday? People moved from A to B, people did that, but it was like 10% because most of the stuff happened in their head. Nowadays we have internet, so we know that people shared something on Twitter, that they commented on that they thought about it, that they had some motivations, but in the past it is difficult, especially if we don't have like sources like myths, legends, some sources like thinking patterns of those people, maybe some philosophical treatises, etc. Because now we see ruins and remnants from ancient Egypt. We have some sources, but for sure they are not all. It was like at least 2000 years from the end of the ancient Egypt, but we want, for instance, to know about the pyramids. Scientists assume that pyramids were built 2500 years before current era, so 4500 years ago. During that time of 4500 years ago, most of the remnants are not existent right now. Nowadays, I also, started questioning things that we learn nowadays because journalism is so corrupted. We are threatened that, we are that all the waste, plastics, metals, cans, foils, papers, etc., are so bad that even after generations, all of the litter, all of the rubbish will still exist. But it is not true. Because, for instance, plastic degrades in just hundreds of years. So if Columbus used plastics, most of them wouldn't exist right now. It is a fact. The same goes for other materials that we use nowadays. If our civilization, I started thinking like that, there was also some apocalyptic shows on TV at that time, so I started thinking about that. What would happen if we cease to exist right now today? Maybe there wouldn't be some catastrophe like some comet strike, etc. But what if we stopped existing right now? If we there would be some pandemic, etc. Most of the remnants would cease to exist after a few hundreds of years. But there still would be some remnants we will say that someone existed. After a few thousands of years, there would be just a little bit of stuff and we would need to dig things, we would need to dig in some places to find it. But after tens of thousands of years, our modern civilization would almost completely cease to exist. I would say 95% of day-to-day materials and of our entire civilization would cease to exist. The 5% would be either some stuff that would be, for instance, in airtight layers, like maybe some oil would be, spoiled over something, and it would be, of course, preserved for much longer. Maybe like we've got some mammoths from 10,000 years ago that have still veins, that have still all of the tendons, all of the blood, because they actually frozen, and they froze suddenly, and because of that we can see all of the tendons and all of the soft tissue of them. But in other examples, like of a casual day-to-day life, those tissues would cease to exist and we would only have skeletons. And after, more and more time, even skeletons cease to exist because they are degrading. The degradation is really fast, and actually we think that we know so much about the dinosaurs, about the prehistory of our planet, but actually even those dinosaurs and even all of those skeletons and remnants we have are only a small tiny fraction, tiny percentage of all the stuff that existed during our past, because the degradation is really, really quick. And we have some remnants from millions of years ago because most of them were in airtight layers, as I mentioned. Some mammoths froze to death suddenly. Maybe some dinosaurs were, within airtight layer of oil or something, or maybe they were in the mud. So those skeletons didn't degrade, but other skeletons, like 90% of other skeletons, degraded, and we do not have almost any evidence of them. So when it comes to our history, and especially the older parts of our history, we are relying on a still small percentage of evidence, and we are trying to make the entire picture. And that's why I think that we are too arrogant to think that we know so much about our history, because even all of the remnants that we have from ancient Egypt are, maybe I would say, 50% from those 2000 years BC, for instance, maybe 50, maybe 40%, because people at that time, according to the current paradigm of history, used mainly natural materials like stones. We still have Stonehenge, we still have pyramids, because these are natural materials. Like, stones are millions of years old. So if you put them in your buildings, those buildings would, with those stone construction would still exist after tens of thousands of years, or even in some cases millions of years after, because they are natural. But when it comes to other, like, materials like plastics, glass, metals, those stuff degrade very, very fast. So we are very biased because archaeologists and historians are saying that we know so much, but they don't take into consideration that these sources are still, there aren't many sources, and most of the sources, ceased to exist long time ago, and we do not know much about those very, very old epochs about our history. So we are really, really biased about our history, and we think that also, when it comes to that bias, it is very important to understand another thing. This is one thing about the degradation. Another thing is about bias when it comes to the scientific method. I mentioned one assumption about materialism, but when it comes to history, most of the scientists are thinking that if we go with the scientific method, we will get the greatest and the most accurate, most objective picture of our past. But this is still not true, because, as I mentioned, we are not relying on all the data. And I would prefer to have the true picture on our past, than the picture which is most objective and which is most, I would say, politically correct and scientifically correct with all our theories and assumptions. I would prefer to discover the truth than the most objective, logical picture of our past. This is another mistake, that we are too much into our logical understanding, into all of the assumptions. And our logical understanding is a little bit like an algorithm. And when it comes to our history and archaeology, this algorithm has plenty of different data that was gathered throughout our past. But it doesn't mean that we are discovering the true picture. It means that we are discovering the picture that is in accordance to the rules that we say are important in history and archaeology. And it is a different philosophy to argue if all of those assumptions that we are taking when we dig something and when we interpret something when it comes to historical data, we have to philosophically assume that they are true, but we can argue if they are actually true. And again, objectivism logic is only one way of looking at nature, at truth, at our history, because we assume that if something is logical, it may be true. But this is only our mind stuff. Logic is only our, we may say, material things, evolutionary approach to our survival. And what if we aren't adapted to understand the truth? We are still, as biological organisms, as humans, we are still a little bit biased when it comes to survival. We have still, despite all of the logic in the world, we have still some carnal desires. We still sometimes are mistaken by our own brains, which is playing our mind tricks. We have plenty of illusions when it comes to our sight. We have plenty of illusions when it comes to our hearing. We only see a fraction of the world around us because our eyes are adapted evolutionary to survive, the same with our ears. And we assume that the logical explanation would be true. But what if logic and logical thinking is another, only adaptation of our survival that isn't about the true world? You know what I mean? The same with our eyes. They are adapted to our survival, so we only see a percentage, a fraction of the world around us. But if we had an entire picture of the electromagnetic spectrum, it would be chaos and would be completely different. But we see the colors, we see other animals see different colors. And what if our minds are the same thing? You know what I mean? That what if this logic is for us to survive, and maybe it is in some percentage correct about the world around us, but what if it is still not entirely true, not fully capable of actually getting us into the true workings of the world around us? So we are like many of the people, especially within the skeptics, within the higher echelons of academia, have so much in their minds. I also experienced that I read so many books, etc., so many theories that I was started having, as we mentioned during our last conversation, assumptions. I started having so many assumptions that I was more about, fitting the world to my assumptions than to looking at truth. The same with, because science wants to be objective. So objective should be more about the truth, but still objectivism and logic have some rules to it. And what if those rules are not entirely correct in accordance to truth? They are still like a prism on our eyes, like some sunglasses that are showing us only one perspective about the universe. So there are many things to logic, there are many things to science at the holistic level, and many things to history. The one side being all our assumptions when it comes to the scientific methods and methods of historians and archaeologists, and the other should be about how many things exist after some period of time and how many things survive. And if we start to look without those assumptions and without all the knowledge we have, we start to see that there is a huge, as we mentioned at the beginning, potential to our history. There could have been so many things. It is the same as we mentioned during our last conversation, that in flow, when we are in the flow state, we can do so many things in a short period of time that later, if we analyze it logically, it is impossible. Maybe we plan something to do a project in a period of a month, but then we are in a flow state and we do it in 1 or 2 days, and it is impossible. And the same may be with the historical understanding, that we are understanding it from a logical perspective. This planning a project for 30 days, and we think that only so many things could have happened during our past because we only have that potential. But then if we go into the flow state, if we go to truth, and you mentioned to source, we see that so many more things could have happened during our history. So I think that this should clarify our understanding of the history and modern approach to history, which is also very important to know how scientists, historians, archaeologists approach our history, and that this approach may not be the correct way, may not be the way to truth, even if it is objective.
Wow. I mean, this brings me to two of the controversial topics that we were sort of touching on. What do you know about this whole revelation they're having about Jesus being trained by Thoth and all this kind of stuff? I mean, yeah, like where did that come from? Do you have any idea?
Yes, I would say that this is more not material evidence based. That's why at the beginning I wanted to distinguish the channeled source, like, or even information from the source, from official historical perspective. I like to, it is also a little bit of training for me to be able to distinguish that for that, and it can bring me a fresh perspective that this may not be true and this may not be true. I can look at it objectively. And when it comes to Jesus, there is a mystery about, the missing years of Jesus, because not only in the Bible, but with all the biblical sources, as you mentioned, plenty of things were excluded when it came to the official version of the Bible. from our sources, there is a huge gap in the life of Jesus. It is like we have the life of Jesus at the beginning when he was born and first of his years. Then we have a huge gap during his like years of maturing and then early adulthood. And then we have his years of like being 30-ish of something. And we have those lost years. And that's why many people speculate, as you mentioned, maybe he was, in secret trainings, maybe by Thoth, which is, I think, mostly based on mostly those channeled sources either maybe on speculation, which is also nice to sometimes speculate. But when it comes to those missing years, I think more true evidence is for Jesus coming to India or to Middle East for training. And we have plenty of names similar to Jesus. Jesus, in Greek, I think it was Issos. And we have, for instance, in India, Issa, a master who came during a similar period in our history, who was of similar age to Jesus during his lost years from the Bible. So I would rather say that Jesus went to East, to Middle East, maybe even to India, as some people suggest. And plenty of people, I know an author and researcher, Paul Wallis, who investigated a lot into these lost years of Jesus. And there are plenty of like evidence-based stuff, like material evidence for someone similar to a figure of Jesus being in India. But when it comes to Jesus being like an apprentice of Thoth, etc., I didn't investigate it extensively, but from what I know, it is mostly about showing similarities between teachings of Thoth and the teachings of Jesus. But we have to remember that the teachings of Jesus were, of course, I would assume they were mostly from the source, but they were also inspired by the Jewish teachings. And when it comes to the wisdom of Thoth, most of the sources about the books of Thoth, the Tabula Smaragdina Emerald Tablet, Corpus Hermeticum, and the Hermeticism, those sources that we know were maybe attributed to Thoth were compiled between 3rd century BC to 3rd century AD. So in those hermetic sources were largely influenced also by Jewish thought. And that's why we have so many similarities between teachings of Jesus, who often mentioned the Jewish teachings from before him, and the teachings from the Hermeticism and the teachings of Thoth. So, we should look at everything from multiple perspectives, from multiple levels, because it is easy to, give a comparison or a chart of Thoth and Jesus and show that, they are almost the same. But, if we take a look at the sources when it comes to Thoth, most of the sources promoted by all of those, I would say, guru influencers, not in the bad way, but those people who are promoting this stuff online are from the late antiquity. And we know, to give a historical perspective, Hermeticism was actually a mixture from many philosophies and religions, actually, because Hermeticism was created after the conquest of Alexander the Great. And the Library of Alexandria in Egypt was created, and in that library there were sources after the conquest of Alexander the Great from India, Persia, Babylon, Mesopotamia, Greece, from all around the ancient world at that time, except from maybe China and Americas. But Alexandria and Egypt at that time was a cradle of different philosophies, religions, of different races, people. And that's how Hermeticism actually appeared, because Hermeticists wanted to discover the truth. So they wanted to make a universal, it was not philosophy at all, it was a mixture of philosophy and religion and science. So it was like, that's why sometimes the Hermes Trismegistus is called Trismegistus, thrice greatest. There are different approaches to that, but it was a mixture of everything. And that's how, in that mixture, there were plenty of teachings of the Jews. There were plenty of teachings of the Egyptians. There were plenty of teachings of the Hindu. So that's why Hermeticism is similar, we can say, to the Bible. It has parallels in the Jewish thought. It has parallels in Hinduism. It has parallels with Zoroastrianism, with everything, because there were philosophers at Alexandria who were studying extensively all of the sources, and as most philosophers, they wanted to discover the universal truth. So they were taking inspiration from this source, this source, this source, this source. So it shows a large misunderstanding of modern new age, I would say, people when they approach stuff like that, sometimes really shallow without looking at more and more sources. And I still see, the more I learn, that the more I don't know and the more sources I don't have. I see that I don't have all the sources, but I still can see some inconsistencies, and I can see that there are plenty of misunderstandings in the modern world. And it is what I mentioned at the beginning in one of the Hermetic fragments. There is a mention that all the ancient wisdom will be corrupted in translation, etc., because most of the people, like modern new age influencers, are maybe not translators but interpreters of the data. So they corrupt to some extent the original wisdom. And I'm open to speculation, I'm open to that, I'm open to discovering the truth, because you mentioned that you mentioned Thoth, low vibe, etc. I also think that plenty of ancient sources are low vibe. Plenty of ancient sources are maybe not untrue, but not 100% true. Half wisdom, half lies, half imagination, etc. Some sources are lies. Some are lying to achieve something. They wanted to achieve power at that time, so they were saying things like that.
Well,
So it
I'll just bring
is
your
much more
attention.
complicated.
I was going to say, Alex, I'll bring your attention to what else he also said. He is not Hermes.
Mm.
That's what he told me directly. Do not distinguish. There is a dramatic difference, Thoth to Hermes, and Hermes frequency is completely different to Thoth's frequency. And Thoth is like, don't make that twisted. He literally said that to me. Don't twist it. There's a distinct difference between myself and Hermes. What are your thoughts on that?
Exactly, another corrupted thing, because nowadays Thoth, Hermes, Trismegistus, which is partially correct, partially because maybe it is the same like area, the same not direct source, but the same area. You know what I mean? Like areas of knowledge, like chemistry. We've got different types of chemistry, but even when it comes to the sources I studied about the Hermeticism, Thoth, Hermes, etc., there are so many different versions. Even in the one version, there is a person above Hermes and Thoth and everyone called Daimon. And again, daimon, demon, Agathos, it is a good, but daimon, there are so many levels to that. In some versions there is only Thoth and maybe some of his students, but in another there is Thoth, Tat, similar people, but there is even speculation among scholars analyzing these texts. Was Thoth Tath? Were there different persons? What happens here? There are, throughout the ages, especially as I mentioned, it was multicultural, multi-philosophical stuff happening at the Library of Alexandria, and again at those times after the conquest of Alexander the Great. Plenty of things already back then were distorted and corrupted. And we said at the beginning about going for historical truth. How can we go for historical truth if even at those ancient times those sources are already corrupt? And nowadays they're even more corrupt, with Thoth, Hermes, Trismegistus, as you mentioned, Thoth being different to Hermes, etc. Were there not? There is so many corruption, and people are making more and more chaos, more and more corruption, mostly because of those low vibes. Because if you're in high vibe, you are, I think, creating more order from chaos. There is order and there is chaos. And from my experience being in low emotion, low vibe, you experience more and more chaos, and this chaos grows. And it would be metaphysically correct to some extent, because if we take like a spectrum from high vibe to low vibe, it would be that this would be the creation, this would be the destruction. polar opposites. You know what I mean? Polarity at some point. Maybe it is true, maybe not, but philosophically it would be correct that low vibe would mean death. High vibe would mean life. High vibe would mean creation. Low vibe would mean destruction. So high vibe would mean order. Low vibe would mean destruction. But again, we are thinking in polar terms, which is again, in my opinion, wrong and not completely true, because we've got, for instance, feminine and masculine. And so what? We should assume that feminine is low vibe, death, and chaos. It is, of course, those archetypes like feminine, great mother, chaos, mother nature, and the great father, God, this biblical archetype of God being the father, the masculine side. But it doesn't mean that, the same with low vibe, high vibe, but it doesn't mean that this is worse than this, because these are the true, like Tao Te Ching, yin and yang. There is some good in the bad, and there is some bad in the good. There is some order within the chaos, and there is some chaos within the order. Like in the Hindu thought that, without the destruction, there couldn't be creation, because if everything was created, there wouldn't be more potential to create more. You need to destroy something, you need to let go of something, you need to eliminate something from your life to maybe have something new and to create something. So this is there is happening a lot of things during this conversation.
Yeah, yeah. So, could you got any insight between her hermetic principles and chematic principles? What's the difference there?
Yes, so it is a historical fact, but also to some extent that Kemet was actually the name of ancient Egypt. But modern Kemeticism and Kemetology is in many parts distorted and not completely true. But again, Hermetic and Kemetic, there is a similarity when it comes to those words. And actually, that's interesting because Kemet was this ancient word of ancient Egypt, this, black land, this fertile land above the Nile, because the Nile was having this land abundant. That's why it is black land, because the soil was darker and more abundant. But when it comes to the Hermeticism, it is also a word that it's universal throughout the ages, because even nowadays we say that something is hermetically sealed. So this word is still in usage nowadays, and it was in usage very, very long ago, because we've got Hermes, also Hermes, Hermetica, hermetically sealed. So these words are very interesting because they are very, very old. But when it comes to the Hermetic principles, the 7 principles of Kybalion, I studied it a lot, both Kybalion and original Hermeticism, original sources that we have, and there are some of the 7 Hermetic principles in the ancient texts, but they are never said to be 7 Hermetic principles like those in the Kybalion. And I would even say that Kybalion is again a little bit distorted, or even in a large part distorted version of the Hermeticism. It isn't, the true Hermetism. When we learn from the ancient text, it is different. There are some, as I mentioned, some of similarities, but this stuff is completely different. But when it comes, this Hermetic principles, Kemetic principles, of course, Hermeticism was based also on the Kemetic Egyptian wisdom, because Kemetic wisdom, we mean ancient Egyptian wisdom. So we've got some Egyptian myths, some Egyptian legends, Egyptian cosmology of how the world was created, etc. And we see in Hermeticism from the ancient times that, as I mentioned, it was influenced by the ancient Egyptian mythology, wisdom, and legends. But the Hermeticism isn't 100% Kemetic wisdom, ancient Egyptian wisdom, because as I mentioned, it was after the conquest of Alexander the Great, and we can clearly include plenty of different parallels from many philosophies. So Hermeticism is like an attempt by ancient philosophers to unify all the knowledge that they possess at that time, which was, I think, a nice attempt from their side. But again, many people make a mistake that Hermeticism is solely 100% ancient Egyptian, and it isn't. There is plenty of Zoroastrianism, there is plenty of Hinduism, there is plenty of beliefs from ancient Mesopotamia, there is plenty of even Platonism, Jewish thought, etc. But when it comes to the main, like for instance, first Hermetic principle, mentalism, all is mind, all is one mind, everything is mental, etc. Universe is mental, something along the lines of that. First Hermetic principle. And in the beliefs of ancient Egypt, there was a similar principle that everything is one, everything is atom. That atom was this primeval being that Egyptians were not able to depict. Atom was like an abstract idea of everything, like a modern infinity, and everything appeared from atom. And only after atom created everything, we can see that there are different gods, there is different distinction. I would say that atom is like everything oneness within a state that you cannot distinguish everything. If there is everything, there is nothing. How you describe that. Infinite, it is called infinite also in the, of course, I mentioned ancient Egyptian beliefs. Atom is like infinite potential. It is within the infinite waters of potentiality, Nun, and it is just sitting there. And again, one time he decided to like Big Bang blow up and create universe from this potential. But it is a nice metaphor for like a metaphysical cosmology, because we've got infinite potential that you cannot describe. It is like infinite waters, infinite potential, and atom is like you cannot describe him, so it is everything, it is nothing. There is no world at that time. Philosophers are, arguing why there is something rather than nothing. At that point, when there is atom, there is infinite potential, there is nothing, there is something, you cannot describe it. It is that state. That's why it is one of those abstract ideas that may, be an argument for my theory, I would say, that our logical understanding cannot show us the truth, that our logical understanding is limited to some extent, that we cannot go before, whether there is something than nothing. Our logical mind cannot explain that. We cannot explain some of those metaphysical things because our logical brains are only material brains to some extent, like algorithm within the like artificial intelligence. I would compare our brains, our minds, like physical minds, not that intuitive soul, but our like logical intellectual minds to artificial intelligence. And we can, as creators of an artificial intelligence, it depends on the input that we provide the artificial intelligence. It can outsmart us as humans, but it will never outsmart all the data that we gathered as humans. The same with our brains. If those brains were created as an adaptation to survival of our species, it is limited to that area. So that's why, maybe those metaphysical speculations aren't good for our survival as material, physical, advanced species of apes. Maybe it isn't for our benefit. So maybe we shouldn't have that capable. We shouldn't be capable of thinking about that and of giving us the true answer. That's why I think science is very limited to understanding the truth. Philosophy is also limited, but philosophy sometimes involves like higher thinking capabilities, like not only algorithmical thinking, but also intuition, also imagination, which imagination we can assume is the bigger bubble than the logic. Like logic would be the small, like the beliefs would be our small bubble, then there would be logic and all the logical possibilities, and then the bigger bubble would be imagination. And there is the bigger bubble, the entire existence. So we see that this principle of mentalism, all is one, all is mental, is very similar to the ancient Kemetic, ancient Egyptian wisdom, knowledge about the atom, because he's creating from his thought. And it is like a good analogy for the logos. I think you're aware of the biblical creation logos, like I think it is in John, that at the beginning was the word and word was with God, etc. in the Bible. And this word in the main Greek version is logos, which is also thought. But ancient Egyptians had it understood much more, because they said that atom, this infinity, first thought of something and then it spoke it into existence, which is a parallel to the Hindu version that the the first sound created everything. So this is like our creation in this body. Like if I want now to create something, I first need to think of it. I need to have a plan. Like I want to build a house. I imagine a house and then I speak it into existence. I create physical action to create it. The same with atom. He thought he had like a blueprint for the universe, like maybe this 0 point field, this blueprint, this matrix, and then it appeared physically by his thought, maybe by sound, like in the version of the Hindu thought. So we see plenty of connections. I analyze those sources and I see that they are talking about maybe the same thing but in different words from different perspective. Like if I show 10 different people the same phenomenon, the same thing, and I say everyone, each of you should write about it, like a sacred text, like one person would write a Bible, one person would write Egyptian mythology, one person would write Vedas, etc., another Tao the Qing. And it is the same phenomenon of creation, of metaphysics, but from different perspectives. And you mentioned similarities between Hermetic, Kemetic, but it is much more. It is influenced, Hermeticism was influenced by almost all the knowledge that was available at that period of time. The same, of course, with modern versions of the Hermeticism, the same with the Kemetic wisdom, and it is much, much more.
Well, yeah, so this brings me to a question. What are your thoughts on the laws of the universe? Because they sort of have some type of like assumption or association with these hermetic principles. What are your thoughts on the laws
Mhm.
of the universe? Because they people define it as a different processes or understanding of how things work.
Mm-hmm. I would I will go for the basics. So, seven hermetic principles. The first I mentioned that all is mind. And in ancient Egyptians it was that, it was a mental creation. In modern physics, it would be a blueprint. Nowadays, because I also say that science is materialistic, but modern physics for like the last few years, only a few years, not even a decade, was more and have been more and more about information. That it isn't about the material particles, but about the information, about the forces that are, making that matter to appear in that form. And again, in Plato, ideas, the Plato word of ideas, Plato says that first there's an idea and then there is matter. He mentioned that, we cannot have in our physical reality a perfect circle or a perfect square. It won't ever be perfect because if you go with a microscope and go deeper and deeper, you will see that it is scratchy. It isn't perfect. It's never perfect. But in our minds, we can imagine a perfect circle. It's easy and we can infinitely zoom it like a fractal pattern and it will be infinite in our minds, but it will never be infinite and perfect in this material world. So it is similar so Plato assumed that first there is the mind ideal, and he mentioned it is idealism that the first there is a blueprint, like a mind, like in the Hermetic principle that all is mind, that first there is a mind, first there is a blueprint for the universe, and then it appears. So the same is with modern physics, that there is an information, there are forces of physics, there are different states which make matter appear in certain patterns. Because of it's like DNA, because of the DNA, the creature like me and you appear in this pattern, in this shape, and with different DNA it appears with different shape. It is like a matrix. I mentioned last time that matrix, we think of this movie, but in this movie matrix, like those all of those numbers, like a code. And the matrix in Polish, for instance, and I think in English also, it's maciej. It's like mathematical term for the blueprint of something, from the blueprint from which you can deduce an equation, and from the equation you can deduce the law, and from the law you can deduce how matter will behave, how a projectile will be shot. You can calculate that. You know what I mean? So this mind, it's a metaphor because it's an idea, like Plato idea of that you can have perfect or infinite. and it manifests. We talk about law of attraction in modern new age and all of the influencers guru. It is that idea manifests, itself, but first there's an idea. And this world is the matrix. This world isn't the matrix. The matrix is the blueprint for this world. The same with holographic universe. It is all the same. We've got the projector, which projects the hologram. So we've got a device that projects information. And this information is then, for instance, we've got a screen, and we've got those screens that are projected onto a wall, for instance, in the cinema. But the projector has all of the information, and the matrix is all of the code that makes the projector show on screen all of the things. The same with the holographic universe, but with more dimension, not a screen, but with 3D, 4D, 5D, etc. But the same with this Plato's ideas, that first there's an idea which may be perfect, and then it is at the same time the second principle of as above, so below. So as in the projector, so in the projection. As within my thoughts, so without. As above, like in the fractal pattern, as above, so below. It is all corresponding, the law of correspondence. It is the same with physics. So the information and the laws of physics dictates how the universe behaves and how the matter behaves. The same thing. The same idea in ancient Egypt, that the first was the atom. Atom had a thought, a blueprint for the universe, so he created it. And it is, I think that the universe is just as it is. So it is like maybe the universe, the source, just creates it because with no reason. You know what I mean? That it has just blueprint, maybe what we would call a desire, but in a much higher level perspective, not like our desires. But the source, some people say that the consciousness is the source. We say also that our consciousness is projecting everything in our lives. So the same is, I think, with the universe. And the same within those two first Hermetic principles, that the source, whatever it is, projects this information, has it in this information, and this information manifests. The creation at the entire level, the creator, the source, is the same as us, in a sense that as above, so below. So we say that we've got fractal patterns, as in the upward pattern, so in the below pattern, as in the projector, so in the projection. So for instance, the atoms are similar to the solar system and to similar systems of planets. So the same as we have inside of us some ideas, information, we manifest them. For instance, a sculptor is manifesting, has an idea for a sculpture and is sculpting it, and he creates it. And just as we create our own lives, that we have inside of us some ideas of how we should do that, the same with the creator, the above level. But with, of course, there is no body for, I don't know, we don't know about this level, but it corresponds to our level, that there is some idea or something similar to our understanding of idea, and then it creates. And the same with the blueprint, or in physics, the information that is making particles go in that direction. And it's the same like Plato's ideas. We see that all of those philosophical systems and ancient knowledge and modern knowledge and science is showing us, as I mentioned, the same thing from different perspective. And this very, maybe not stupid, but as I mentioned, 10 people trying to describe the same phenomenon, but with locked, they don't see each other's works. But then after they show their works to the teacher, for instance, they describe the thing, the phenomenon, all of them are arguing that no, my religion is different. No, physics, there is no connection with, when it comes to physicists, there is no connection with Hermeticism with this. It is not about the mental universe. No. It is not about the Plato's world of ideas. And the same Plato world of the ideas, no, it is metaphysical, it is non-physical. You know what I mean? It is interesting that all of those perspectives think that they exclude each other, but they are showing the same thing, whether we look at Hinduism. Most probably similar stuff is in Tao Te Ching, similar stuff is in ancient Kemetic wisdom, and similar stuff is with modern science. And again, we mentioned the corruption of ancient wisdom. I mentioned it in simplistic way, in which we have everything at once. And the Hermetic principles are divided. But those principles are actually showing us one reality. They shouldn't be like divided. I mentioned that the first mental principle is connected or even the same, maybe the other side of the same coin when it comes to the law of correspondence, as above so below. And again, I mentioned matrix and blueprints for creation, and fractal patterns are the best evidence for that, because fractal pattern is a blueprint that exists in the physical universe. We see that our veins are like fractal patterns, and the same stuff like our veins are, for instance, rivers on the face of the earth. Similar thing is when it comes to nature, like plants. They show like similar fractal patterns. The same with conch shells, seashells, etc. We see the same blueprint for the universe manifested on different levels. So it is all the same. Those two first laws are the same. And the same we've seen with information and physics and matter. The same we've seen with Kemetic, Hermetic, Hindu. The same we've seen with, for instance, Plato's ideas, that there is an idea, a blueprint for everything. And we have physical evidence for that. So it all connects.
It's mind blowing, my friend. I can't even believe we're probably got 5 or 10 minutes left here. And again, my invitation is you're going to be back here in another week or two, because your incredible insight never leaves me. I might as well just give you a seat here, because I'll keep pushing out your information because it's powerful, and I know it's real, and the tangibility of your insight is beyond your biological age. It has nothing to do with it. That's the really powerful part. It's mind blowing. In closing today, and we're going to go into what would you like to speak on our next episode, because I know we haven't even scratched the surface. You got so much. Let's give the audience a little taste of what's to come next time. And I'm going to be I was pretty quiet today, and we didn't even scratch the surface on your stuff. I want to get it out.
I just started, I can say. But
Yeah.
the problem with me is that in the previous talk, we wanted to initially talk about stuff, and we went to, again, spirituality, metaphysics, truth, logic, assumptions, mind, brain, etc. And again, in this conversation, we should have talked about only history, mostly history. But we again thought about talked about the universe, metaphysics, mental, and universal stuff. And I even sometimes can't not comprehend, but I can't label those things that I'm talking about. I'm just, talking about, I would say the problem with me talking is that I don't have like a clear vision. I'm just, talking about different stuff. Then I'm interrupting myself and, giving some another information, because I see as everything as connected. I don't see like many people like in the academic world. They see history, they see physics, they see chemistry. I see the universe. I see maybe time as another thing, and I see that, it all connects. But the problem with me is that it is hard still for me to go and make a clear vision of that. You know what I mean? That I cannot go as to talk, in a line. Like I cannot go from A to B, from B to C, from C to D, not linearly. I go like in multiplies. That
I love it.
I like
I
a
absolutely
hand.
love
That imagine that this is a hand, and now from this I'm go again, and I
Well,
started to talking about this, but there are 5 different stuff. So I
I
choose
think
one, like a map, like a,
I think
I
it's amazing.
cannot even say what
I think
this
it's
is the
amazing.
problem.
Yeah, there isn't a problem, my friend. I think it's incredible.
Yes,
So let's give the audience a little taste of what would you like to dive into in the next week or two when we get you back on here?
yes.
What part of history? What history would you like? Because I need the audience to understand he has such an insight into so many histories.
This is the
And
problem.
so it's like it's not a problem, my
No,
friend.
it's not the
That's one of the
problem,
things
actually.
that resonates with me and you, and just the whole thing. So let's pick a history timeline that you would like to start
Yes,
with.
I think because I mentioned that I cannot distinguish those things, only talk about one topic, but actually writing helps with doing that, with clearing your mind on a particular topic and going in depth on one and focusing on one. So we'll talk more about the stuff from my book, which I highly recommend everyone to read. It has plenty, tons of information. So we will go into all of the sources and all of the evidence, which we started at the beginning, that our history is much, much older, and we will focus mostly in 80-90% of the material stuff, that our history is much older, about lost civilizations, lost episode of humanity, etc. And I think that we should distinguish that from the end of our conversation with all of the historical perspective on the philosophies, etc. So next
Yeah.
time, history, hard evidence-based, source-based history, mostly ancient history and prehistory.
And that's where we're going to leave it here today. So look for the next chapter, because Alex is basically a standing a guest on this channel, because I'm profoundly grateful for his insight in so many different levels. So basically, you might as well just consider him a permanent resident here on this channel, because we're going to keep going and we're going to keep going. People need to understand how powerful his insight is and his depth of understanding of across historical timelines and all different layers. It's very, very, it's mind blowing. And we need to understand this. Nothing, and the charge you and I are getting right now, you get it. Nothing has to do with biological age. Let's get this very clear. And that's why, my goodness, even though we might have to nudge Alex a little bit in the concept or idea that maybe he's channeling his insight, that could be something that could be a little hard to digest for him at this moment. But just to throw it out there, my friend, you're getting incredible insight to things across the board. And if you haven't pondered that idea, maybe you should. I don't know.
And I thank you, because I
Yeah.
learn a lot during such conversations, because what I am trying to conclude is that I have so many things that I sometimes forget them. And, I'm just talking here on another podcast, and I'm, having a clear, thematic topic perspective. And this is my problem. I could, write 10 books at once, but I cannot focus on one and going from start to finish. But I, can write a few pages, 10 or 20 pages every day on 10 different topics. And I need to have all that knowledge. I think it is so much that I need to, with podcasts, with writing, with maybe content creation. I need to go back to videos, etc. on my channel. So I highly recommend everyone to go to my channel.
Go to
I need
Alex's
to
channel.
get an every topic, select one topic and all of the information on that. Then pause, different topic, and all of the information on that. And I can make an entire library. But the problem right now is that I have already this library, but it isn't categorized. It isn't labeled. There isn't from A to Z. It is you took all of the books and throw it down on the ground. So
You see, our relationship will help you do that. So we'll just keep doing episodes, and you can focus on one part of it and
I will
dive deep
try.
into it as the audience wants to do it. It will help you stay there. How's that sound?
Yes, yes.
I like it.
And for the end, I highly recommend everyone checking out my book, which will help me with publishing more books.
Yes, yes. So everyone check out Alex's channel, check out his book. I'll put all his social under here. And after we get off this podcast, I'll send you an email and we'll have you back on in a week or so. And just keep going, because it doesn't end, my friend. It just doesn't end. So I want to thank you, Alex, for sharing your time with us today. Powerful insights and correlation across historical timelines in religion, philosophy. It's wild. It's awesome. And I want to thank the audience for sharing their time with us today. I am your humble servant and seafood, Taoist Master San Qing, and I'll see you in the next one, guys.